The sea was quiet in the hour before it began, not still, but quiet in the way a battlefield sometimes is before the first shot cracks across the silence. Out in the English Channel, men sat in boats with their thoughts tucked under their helmets, bobbing in the black water. Some chewed gum like it was a tether to normal life. Some clutched rosaries. Others stared at the cliffs rising out of the French coast like the edge of a broken world. Atop those cliffs was Pointe du Hoc. It wasn't just a high point, it was a fortress. A tangle of concrete bunkers and artillery casemates dug into sheer rock 100 feet above the sea. It overlooked the beaches of Omaha and Utah with a clear view, and it housed something that Eisenhower's planners feared even more than the steel in its walls, its guns. 6 155mm German artillery pieces, the kind that could rip a landing craft in two from 10 miles away. They were old French designs, repurposed by the Wehrmacht, but their range and angle of fire made them the perfect gatekeepers to the American beachheads. So the Allies made a plan. They would take the cliffs. But not with tanks, not with ships, not even with bombers. They would send Rangers, about 225 of them. Volunteers trained not just to shoot, but to scale. Their orders were to land below the cliffs, fire ropes with grapnels, climb under fire, breach the bunkers, and silence the guns before they could speak. It was a plan so dangerous some commanders quietly doubted it could work. But in war, doubts sit behind action. And the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion had no room for doubt, only for the climb. Their leader was Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, Texas-born, West Point scarred, quiet, not flashy, but sharp in the way good commanders are when the stakes are absolute. He had drilled his men until muscle memory replaced hesitation. He had tested them on rock walls, cliffs, rope ladders, and he knew that the only thing standing between success and slaughter on Omaha Beach might be whether or not his men could defy gravity under machine gun fire. On June 6, 1944, just after dawn, the sea moved with a pulse that echoed thunder. Battleships opened up on the cliffs. The USS Texas fired its 14-inch guns until the earth above the point danced. Allied planes swooped in and loosed their payloads, sending fire and sand into the sky. And under that smoke cover, the landing craft moved forward, 30 of them, low in the water, carrying men with ropes, rifles, and one impossible task. But the sea had its own plans. A current pushed the Rangers west. Their boats landed late and off course. The naval bombardment had already ended. The Germans had emerged from the bunkers. They saw the boats coming, and they opened fire. Bullets chopped the water. Mortars screamed. Some boats were hit before their ramps dropped, but the Rangers didn't stop. They leapt into the surf, ran to the base of the cliffs, and fired their grappling hooks. Most missed. Some ropes fell short. Others hung limply. Wet sand clogged the line throwers, and the cliffs taller than they'd seemed in training stood like walls of wet ash crumbling with every pull. Still, they climbed. They climbed because they had to, because if they failed, the guns could tear Omaha Beach apart before a single tank tread hit the sand. So they found handholds where there were none. They pushed each other upward. Some ropes burned through gloves. Others slipped free. German soldiers leaned over the edges and fired straight down. They kicked at ropes. They tossed grenades. And yet, inch by inch, the Rangers rose. By the time Rudder's men reached the top, only 90 of the original 225 were still combat capable. But they didn't pause. They moved like shadows through smoke. They split into teams and began the sweep. Bunker by bunker, crater by crater, room by room. Some of the German soldiers fled. Others stayed and fought. Inside the gun casemates they found nothing. The 155mm cannons were gone, not destroyed, not buried, just moved. What the Rangers found instead were wooden logs, carefully cut and painted to look like barrels, sitting in place of the guns. It was a decoy, a bluff, the kind of misdirection that in another war might have bought the enemy time. But not here, not now, not with Rudder's men running low on ammo and surrounded on all sides. The mission wasn't over. If the guns weren't here, they had to be somewhere, and if they were mobile, they could still reach the beaches. Rangers split again. Small groups peeled off into the hedgerows beyond the cliffs. They moved fast and silent through a maze of earth and smoke. And finally, near a line of trees and an old dirt road, a patrol found them. 5 of the 6 155mm guns, hidden under camouflage nets, unmanned, pointed inland, waiting for orders, but capable of pivoting toward the beaches at any moment. Sergeant Leonard Len Lomel, a former lifeguard turned killer by necessity, didn't wait for backup. He sprinted forward with Private Jack Kuhn. They carried thermite grenades designed to melt through steel. They set them off inside the gear mechanisms of each gun, rendering them useless. Then smashed the sights and breech controls with rifle butts, ensuring the guns would never fire again. No orders, no delay, just action. They returned to the cliffs. Others were still fighting. The Rangers held the point for 2 more days against multiple counterattacks. They used scavenged weapons, their dead comrades' ammo, and sheer will. When reinforcements finally arrived, only 90 men were still standing. But the guns never fired on Omaha or Utah, because 225 Rangers climbed the forbidden cliffs and changed D-Day before the beaches even heard a shot. When the last of the ropes stopped swaying and the final boots hit the top, the wind carried more than salt. It carried the sound of disbelief. The Germans on Pointe du Hoc had thought the sea would finish the job the artillery had started. They were wrong. The men who climbed those cliffs were not supposed to make it. They had been trained for the impossible, and now they were standing in the middle of it. Colonel Rudder crouched near the edge, his radio half drowned in seawater, its cables frayed. The command ship offshore was calling for an update, but the signal crackled into static. He pressed the receiver close and spoke through the noise. His message was simple: point taken. It was not bravado. It was exhaustion shaped into words. Around him, the point looked like the surface of the moon. Bomb craters overlapped one another. Trenches were blown open, some filled with rainwater, others with the bodies of men who had never expected a fight from below. The Rangers moved through it slowly, weapons tight, nerves tighter. They had trained to storm a cliff, but not to hold a crater field against counterattacks. Still, no one asked to turn back. The first hours after the climb were chaos stitched together by instinct. Patrols swept through the bunkers. They found shell casings, burned ammunition boxes, food rations still warm. The guns were gone, but the garrison had not completely fled. Every few minutes, a burst of machine gun fire broke the silence. The Germans had pulled back into tunnels and dugouts, firing from slits cut into concrete. Each position had to be cleared one by one. Private John Parker remembered crawling through one of those slits, hearing a German voice only a few meters away, and realizing the echo was louder than the man. He pulled the pin on a grenade, counted to 2, and let it roll into the darkness. The blast didn't echo at all. The air simply folded and then went still. When he crawled in, he found the chamber blackened and empty. He said nothing. There was no one left to hear it. By noon, Rudder had secured most of the position, but the cost was steep. Ammunition was low. The radio barely worked. Casualties were mounting not just from enemy fire, but from the fall itself. Broken legs, shattered hands, concussions from rock fragments. The cliff had punished anyone who trusted it. Yet every man who could still stand was now digging, fortifying, expecting the counterattack that everyone knew would come. It arrived just after dusk. German infantry from the 914th Grenadier Regiment began moving toward Pointe du Hoc from the direction of Grand Camp. They were organized, angry, and determined to erase the insult of Americans standing on their fortress. The Rangers saw them through the haze and opened fire. The first volleys were disciplined, aimed. Then the darkness turned the fight into sound and flash. Rifles cracked, grenades thumped, and somewhere in between, voices shouted orders that vanished into the wind. Rudder called for naval support, but the offshore ships couldn't risk firing without clear coordinates. The Rangers were too close to the enemy, so the defense fell entirely to the men on the ground. They used captured weapons, German MG-42s, mortars they had dragged up the cliff, anything that could hold the line. The enemy pressed hard, sometimes within 20 yards of their positions. At one point, a German soldier tossed a bundle of grenades tied together into a Ranger trench. Sergeant Lamel, the same man who had destroyed the guns earlier, dove on it and threw it back before it exploded midair. Dirt rained over them. Someone laughed. It wasn't joy. It was disbelief that they were still alive. The counterattacks faded by morning. The field smelled of smoke and iron. The sun came up pale and slow, lighting a landscape that looked more like ruins than victory. The Rangers took stock. Fewer than 100 men fit for duty, nearly half their weapons damaged, no radio contact, and no sign that the main invasion force even knew they were still holding the cliffs. Yet they stayed, because Rudder had told them to, because they had taken the point, and to leave it would be to give back everything they had bled for. He walked among them, quiet, checking on each position, patting shoulders, handing out spare ammunition from his own pack. His calm was contagious. It didn't erase fear, it gave it direction. That night, the Rangers built barricades out of debris, broken timbers, sandbags, helmets filled with dirt. They ate what they could find. Some slept sitting up. Others cleaned weapons until their hands went numb. Above them, the stars were bright and indifferent. Below, the beach battles raged, but up here the war was condensed to a few hundred yards of wind and will. And then, somewhere past midnight, a distant rumble rolled over the water. Engines. Not German. The Rangers looked toward the horizon and saw the faint flicker of ship guns firing in the distance. The invasion was succeeding. Omaha had held. Utah was pushing inland. Pointe du Hoc had done its job, even if the men here didn't yet know how much the climb had changed the day. The second day began without warning. No trumpet of sunrise, no signal flare, just the slow burn of a gray sky and the steady sound of footsteps through wet grass. Another German counterattack, this time more deliberate. Artillery first, small mortars lobbed from the woods to the south, then sniper fire from the hedgerows, and finally full-movement infantry advancing in groups of 5 and 6, hugging the terrain like water through cracks. The Rangers were ready, not because they had more men or better ground, but because nothing else could surprise them. They had climbed cliffs under fire. Everything after that was just stubbornness. They shifted into defensive rings. Machine guns salvaged from German positions were mounted facing the hedgerows. Riflemen covered trenches from different angles. They had no reserves, so every man on the line knew that if one broke, they all would. Rudder directed everything from a shallow foxhole marked by a broken radio mast. He kept his messages short, conserving words the way they now rationed bullets. His field map was soaked. His boots were cut open at the heel from hours of movement across sharp stone, but he stayed upright. That mattered more than most men realized. By mid-morning, the second German assault stalled. The Rangers had used captured mortars to pin the flanks and sharpshooters to bleed the middle. But the cost was heavy. Every hour without resupply or reinforcement made the defense feel thinner. The men had memorized every inch of ground around them, every crater, every shadow. And still, they were guessing. The enemy could come again at any time, from any side. They dug deeper. Not just trenches, but fighting holes reinforced with anything they could find, wooden doors from bunkers, chunks of collapsed walls, even discarded helmets. The point was no longer a stronghold. It was a skeleton held up by grit and memory. Rudder finally got through to headquarters that afternoon. He used a runner to reach a functioning radio unit half a mile down the cliff, hidden inside a makeshift signal nest. The message he sent was brief but clear. Position held. Urgent need for relief and ammo. The reply came slower than he hoped. Fighting elsewhere was still too intense. The beaches were stable, but barely. The paratroopers inland were scattered. The naval support was tied up hammering inland targets. Pointe du Hoc, they said, was contained. That word stuck. To the men on the ground, it didn't feel contained. It felt forgotten. That night, the third in a row without rest, Rudder's men prepared for another attack. They weren't sure if it would come. Some of the German units seemed to be pulling back. Scouts reported fewer shadows in the tree line, but no one relaxed. They had seen too much to trust silence. Corporal Charles Parker sat in a shell hole and cleaned his bayonet with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. Not because he needed it sharp, but because the motion kept his hands steady. Beside him, Private Amos Bell carved a notch into the stock of his rifle for each confirmed kill. He stopped at 6, not because he ran out of space, but because he no longer wanted to keep count. They talked about home in short bursts, like men stealing warmth from a dying fire. Texas, Georgia, Detroit. Some had wives, some had kids. Most were too young to know what kind of life waited beyond the next bullet, but they kept talking, because silence was heavier than fatigue. Around midnight, the fog came in again. Thick as smoke. It moved across the cliffs like something alive. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. Every shape looked like a rifle. Every shadow twitched. The rangers froze in place, fingers on triggers, hearts steady, not from calm but from exhaustion so deep it felt like stone. No attack came, not that night, just the wind and the cold and the realization that they had lived another day without knowing why. By the fourth morning, the shape of the war was changing. The beaches were secured, inland roads were being cleared, German units were pulling back to secondary lines. But the Rangers on Pointe du Hoc still held alone. Their food was gone. Water came from canteens filled with rain. Wounds were bandaged with uniform sleeves. Some men wrapped wire around their boots to hold them together. And still, they waited. When the first American reinforcements finally reached them on June 8th, 2 full days after the assault, Rudder met them standing. Not because he had strength to spare, but because he refused to be seen any other way. The reinforcements found men they barely recognized. Thin, mud-covered, eyes sunken, but still standing. They brought stretchers, food, ammunition, medical kits, but most of all, they brought proof that the line had held long enough to matter. Pointe du Hoc had not fallen. Its guns had not fired. Its cliffs had not broken the men who climbed them. Word of the assault spread fast. Officers whispered it in command tents. Newspapers wrote around it in coded phrases. Other rangers called it a suicide mission that worked. Some even said it had been unauthorized, impossible, or forbidden. But the men who had done it never used any of those words. They just said they climbed and held. For the rangers who survived the point, time moved differently after the cliffs. The war didn't end. Not for them. Many were folded back into other operations. Some would be wounded later in the hedgerows of Normandy. Others would walk into Belgium and fight again in the Battle of the Bulge. But none of them would see ground the same way after Pointe du Hoc. Because after that climb, every hill looked shorter. Every defense looked temporary. The mind tries to protect itself after something like that. Some memories sharpen, others blur. Sergeant Lamel would later remember the heat of the thermite more vividly than the face of the German soldier he passed in the trench. Private Bell never forgot the sound of wet rope slipping through his fingers or the sickening silence when one man's grapnel missed and there was nothing but falling. They didn't talk about the climb right away. Most of them didn't have the words. It wasn't just the pain. It was the feeling that what they had done, what they had survived, would not be understood by anyone who wasn't there. And yet, as the days passed and the lines moved east, the story started to grow. At headquarters, commanders began to realize the scale of what had happened. Rudder filed reports, but they were dry, matter-of-fact, heavy on the numbers. Casualties, guns disabled, ground held. The emotion didn't live in the paperwork. It lived in the eyes of the men who came back changed. Some generals wanted to know why Rudder had authorized the climb after the landing drifted off course, why he hadn't waited for better weather or stronger naval support. But those questions never made it into formal hearings, because by then the results were already part of the campaign's success. The truth, of course, was that Rudder had followed his orders. But more than that, he had trusted his men. He believed that they could do what the plan demanded, even when every variable turned against them. That belief had held the cliff. Back in London, Allied press offices began shaping the story. They called it heroic, daring, a strike of thunder before the storm. They used words like fearless and elite. Photos were sent to newspapers. Scorched bunkers, shattered casemates, a man standing next to a crater the size of a truck. None of them captured the cold or the ropes or the way silence felt when the enemy was just inches away on the other side of a wall. But the myth had started, and myths in war have weight. The name Pointe du Hoc began to carry a kind of reverence. Commanders began to mention it in speeches. Recruits heard about it during training. And among the Rangers, it became a mark, a quiet bond, like a scar you don't show but always feel. Colonel Rudder didn't celebrate. He received a promotion, then another. But he turned down staff roles and stayed in the field. He didn't give long interviews. He didn't write a book. When asked years later how he led the assault, he just said, "You train hard, and then you go." Nothing more. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, a souvenir from shrapnel that lodged in his hip that day on the cliff. The strategic value of the climb was debated long after the war. Some historians argued that the guns had already been moved before the invasion, that the Rangers risked everything for a position that was no longer armed. Others pointed out that the Germans had only relocated the weapons briefly to avoid naval bombardment, and that they were preparing to move them back within range of Omaha Beach. But even that missed the deeper truth. The assault didn't just prevent fire from the cliffs. It denied the Germans control of a position that could have delayed or fractured the entire invasion. If Pointe du Hoc had remained in enemy hands, the roads behind Omaha would have been vulnerable. Artillery could have harassed the beach for days, and the psychological toll on the Allied forces knowing a fortress still loomed above would have changed the tempo of the entire operation. The Rangers broke that threat, not just with weapons, but with a decision: to climb anyway, to fight at the top, to hold without knowing who was coming next. Back in France, the point remained battered and blackened. The craters were never filled. The bunkers were never torn down. Grass began to grow in the shell holes. Tourists would come years later and walk the same edge the ropes had once hung from. They would stand at the top and look down, tracing the path with their eyes. Most couldn't believe it was ever climbed at all. And yet, in 1944, it had been. By men who were told it couldn't be done. By ropes that weren't supposed to hold. In a place war planners called a suicide zone. And still they climbed. After the war, Pointe du Hoc didn't vanish into the usual blur of military reports and forgotten coordinates. It became something else, a marker. Not just of where the enemy stood, but of how far men were willing to go when orders crossed into the impossible. The site itself was left mostly untouched. Unlike other battlefields that were repurposed or paved over, Pointe du Hoc remained frozen. Concrete bunkers still leaned into the earth, half shattered but unmoved. Craters, deep enough to bury jeeps, still yawned open in the grass. In 1945, when the war ended, it was decided that the site would not be developed or built upon. It would be preserved, not as a museum, as a scar. When President Reagan stood on those cliffs in 1984, marking the 40th anniversary of D-Day, he spoke not just to veterans in the audience, but to history itself. He said, "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs." His words echoed down through the rocks, through time, through the old silence where ropes once swayed under fire. But long before the speeches and ceremonies, it was Rudder himself who set the tone for what the place meant. After returning to the United States, he didn't build a career on fame. He didn't sell the story. He returned to Texas, became president of a small agricultural college, and eventually transformed it into Texas A&M University. He brought with him the same leadership he had shown on the cliffs: firm, patient, never seeking applause. He rarely spoke of the climb, not because he didn't value it, but because he didn't want it to become myth detached from truth. In his office, he kept a rock from the point. No inscription, no frame, just a chunk of cold stone that had once tried to kill his men. The Rangers who had survived scattered after the war. Some returned to civilian life, working as teachers, farmers, mechanics. Others stayed in the military. A few never truly left the cliffs behind. For them, Pointe du Hoc was not just a mission, it was a lens through which they would see everything that came next. At reunions, when they met again in later years, they didn't talk much about the politics of the war or the larger campaigns. They talked about ropes, about boots that slipped on wet rock, about the moment the grapnel caught, about the way a fellow ranger reached down and pulled them up by the wrist. These were the things that stayed. In time, the assault on Pointe du Hoc became required reading at West Point. Military academies around the world studied it as a case of extreme risk with high payoff. It was analyzed for its tactics, its intelligence failures, its improvised successes. But the part that couldn't be diagrammed or charted was the human engine behind it, the quiet agreement among 225 men to do something that had never been done under conditions that should have killed them all. The term forbidden never appeared in any official order, but that's what it felt like. That cliff was a wall no army had ever planned to breach head-on. The idea that it could be climbed in the middle of a live fire zone, under direct observation. With wet ropes and handheld gear, it bordered on lunacy. And yet, because the stakes were so high, the risk wasn't just allowed, it was required. Rudder's leadership during that climb became a model not of genius strategy, but of disciplined daring. He didn't invent new tactics. He didn't discover a flaw in the enemy's defense. He simply prepared his men for the moment when belief had to beat probability. In many ways, that was the hidden power of Pointe du Hoc. It wasn't just a physical place. It was a test of what war can demand when time runs out and nothing else will do. To this day, the site remains open to the public. Visitors walk along a narrow path that winds through the craters. Some of them climb into the old bunkers and look out toward the beach. They see the same cliffs the Rangers saw unchanged by the decades. A small granite monument now stands near the edge overlooking the sea. It lists no individual names, just a simple inscription, "To the heroic Ranger Commandos." But the story wasn't written on that stone. It was written in bruised hands, in shredded boots, in blood trails that curled around the rocks. It was written by men who climbed not for glory, but because no one else would. In the months that followed the liberation of Normandy, after the fighting moved inland and the war began to stretch toward Paris, the climb at Pointe du Hoc settled into the minds of those who had lived it. It no longer moved fast. It stayed in flashes. Some of the Rangers remembered the smell of burning cordite. Others remembered the moment their boots lost contact with the rock. But most of all, they remembered the silence right after it was done. Not celebration, not shouting, just a breath that no one knew they had been holding, finally let out when the last gun was found and shattered. Private First Class William Petty never spoke to anyone about the man who fell beside him in the surf. He remembered his name. He remembered the way he yelled when the ropes first missed their mark. But after the mission, after the climb, Petty just said he made it. That was enough. Corporal Fred Johns couldn't sleep through thunderstorms after the war. Not because of the artillery, but because of the ropes. He said the sound of rain against his windows sometimes reminded him of the wind pulling on wet rope, stretching it, testing its weight. They were young. That's the part easy to forget. Most of them were under 25, a few barely 19. But in those days, the war aged men faster than time. By the end of that week in June 1944, they carried memories that belonged to someone far older. The planners at SHAEF Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had known the risk of the Point assault before it ever began. There had been debates. Some officers thought the climb was unnecessary, that bombers could flatten the position, that a frontal assault on the bunkers was suicide. But the intelligence reports were clear. If those guns stayed intact, they could cover both Utah and Omaha beaches and turn D-Day into a meat grinder. So they had asked for volunteers, not because it was romantic, but because they knew regular units couldn't be asked to scale a wall under fire. The Rangers weren't regular. They were trained not to hold ground but to take it quickly, surgically, before the enemy even understood what was happening. Even still, the idea of ropes fired by rocket launchers from bobbing boats in surf, under machine gun nests, it felt like madness wrapped in logic. But war often distills to math, risk measured against necessity. Pointe du Hoc was a gamble Eisenhower accepted because the alternative was worse. In a quiet corner of a command tent, just days before the landings, one British intelligence officer reportedly said to a colleague, "They won't make it, but we'll honor the attempt." That was the tone, not cruelty, just resignation. A belief that the climb was needed, even if it would fail. That belief never reached Rudder, or if it did, he never showed it. He took the mission with the same calm certainty he used to call out fire positions. He believed in the climb because his men believed in him. After the war, several of those same Rangers became instructors. They taught new soldiers about movement under fire, breaching fortifications, coordinating infantry tactics in terrain where no maps could help. But they rarely mentioned the cliffs, not because they were trying to forget, but because the climb was never about theory. It couldn't be taught. It had to be lived. In one declassified report, a German officer captured weeks after the landings admitted that the point had been considered untouchable. His men had rehearsed repelling amphibious landings. They had laid mines and barbed wire. But they had not prepared for a vertical assault. He said, "We expected boats. We got ghosts." That's how the Rangers looked as they came over the top, mud-covered, silent, rifles wet, eyes unreadable. Not a wave of troops. A thin line of moving shadows that didn't stop when the plan fell apart. That's what stayed in the memory of every survivor. Not the medals, not the after-action reports, but that moment at the top, when nothing had gone right, but they had still come over the edge. The climb didn't just open D-Day. It made everything else possible. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc still stand. They lean over the sea like broken teeth, jagged and wind-bitten. The craters around them now soft with grass and moss. Tourists walk the paths. Children climb the bunker shells. The violence is gone, but the story lingers in the shape of the land. It's written into the silence between the waves and the hollow echo inside the concrete. And yet, the real weight of that place has never been in its soil. It has always been in the men who climbed it. The Rangers of June 6th didn't know they were shaping a symbol. They didn't know they were carving out one of the defining moments of the American war story. They only knew that they had orders, a rope, and a wall that was never supposed to be climbed. But when they reached the top, when they held the ground and beat back wave after wave of counterattacks, something changed in the way D-Day would be remembered. Pointe du Hoc became more than a battlefield. It became proof. Proof that planning could bend to will. Proof that training could overcome fear. Proof that when the path forward vanished, someone would still climb. For Americans, the image of the Ranger reaching the summit under fire became shorthand for the kind of grit the country believed it carried into the 20th century's most brutal war. It wasn't about numbers or maps or even victory. It was about a kind of quiet resolve, grim, deliberate, and without ceremony. Not many of the climbers lived to see how large their story would grow. Time moved on. The war ended. Europe rebuilt. The cliffs stayed. Colonel Rudder returned to France once more in the 1960s. He stood near the edge of the point, now older, walking with a cane. A French official thanked him for liberating the coast. Rudder said little. He looked out toward the sea and said only, "It looked higher from down there." That line was never meant to be poetic. It was memory speaking to itself. For the men who had hung on those ropes, each stone of the cliff was burned into their palms. The climb didn't get easier with time. It just faded behind the rest of the war. Still, every generation that visits the point sees it differently. Some see courage, others see strategy. A few only see stone and wind. But if you stand long enough at the edge, if you close your eyes and listen to the sea, you might catch the echo of boot soles on limestone. You might feel the weight of a rope slipping taut, and you might understand even for a moment what it meant to climb something, not because it was safe or sure or even survivable, but because no one else would. That is how the wall fell. That is how the guns were stopped. That is how one forbidden climb opened D-Day and held it open until the rest could follow.